Does the UK or our allies have specific intelligence that Vladimir Putin is preparing to use chemical weapons, or are we extrapolating this simply from what he has been saying?
Well, clearly, I can't comment on intelligence the UK government may have received. That wouldn't be right to speak about that publicly. But we have seen in the last 24 or 48 hours what appear to be bits of disinformation published by Russian state outlets, including, in fact, the Russian embassy here in London,
Yep.
putting on things like Twitter information that appear to be creating a false narrative that the Ukrainians are considering using chemical weapons, which is clearly ridiculous and totally untrue. And sometimes they do that in preparation. But I hope that is not what they're contemplating. The use of chemical weapons in any theatre of war, but certainly one where there are lots of civilians, totally unacceptable. What we've seen the Russians doing in the last 2 weeks in Ukraine is totally barbaric. We saw them in the last day or two, shelling and bombing hospitals across Ukraine, including a hospital which was where young mothers were, or new mothers were giving birth to children. What they have done is totally barbaric, which is why the United Kingdom is determined, as the Prime Minister was saying, to do everything we can to try and stop them.
But in essence, if Vladimir Putin is willing to bomb a maternity ward, he's willing to do pretty much anything.
Well, as I say, I'm not going to talk about intelligence, but using chemical weapons in an area which has lots of civilians would be a barbaric thing to do. And I would just say to Vladimir Putin and to the Russian regime, not to cross that line, not to do that to civilian populations.
Let's then talk about what we heard yesterday, that finally, eventually, Roman Abramovich has been sanctioned. I'm just wondering, I think many people are wondering this, what has changed in the week since the Prime Minister accidentally, misspoke and said that Abramovich was sanctioned when he wasn't? What have we learned in the past 7 days that has allowed us to move to this position?
Well, the United Kingdom, of course, is a country which respects the rule of law. We have to go through a proper process to make sure that everything is done in a way that's legally watertight. People like Abramovich, have expensive lawyers, and we want to make sure that we don't get challenged. So we've gone through carefully and methodically, putting together a case that is watertight. And yesterday we acted against not just Abramovich, but 6 other oligarchs who control critical Russian companies like Bank, like Rosneft, like Gazprom. These are people, oligarchs and companies who are integral to the Putin regime. They're sustaining him, they're supporting him, they're enabling him, and it's right that we act against them as part of our set of measures. Of course, we've already sanctioned over 300 Russian individuals and entities, and we've worked with other countries to exclude Russia from the SWIFT system, and that's having a big effect.
You have to accept that any oligarch, but particularly someone with the deep pockets of Roman Abramovich, will have moved assets out of the country in the days from when it first became mooted that he would be sanctioned. You have to accept that.
Well, I mean, there are some assets that are hard to move, like Chelsea Football Club, that's not going anywhere, and the house, as far as that hasn't been sold. And of course, we've also done our asset freezes against a number of big Russian banks. We have frozen the assets of about £250 billion worth of Russian bank balance sheet assets. Those were frozen a while ago. And that is more, by the way, than the European Union. It's more than the United States. So those assets have been frozen for some time now.
Well, let's talk specifically about Chelsea. I mean, first and foremost, you're not a fan, are you?
I'm a Palace fan.
OK, fair enough. So apologies. If a suitable buyer for Chelsea was found, is the government currently minded to allow that deal to go through?
Yeah, so as the licence conditions are written today, the sale would not be allowed. However, if a buyer emerged, then it would be open to that buyer or to the football club to approach the government and ask for the licence conditions to be varied in a way that allowed that sale to take place. So they'd be able to approach the government to make a proposal. But to be clear, no proposal would be accepted which saw the money, the proceeds of any sale, ending up in an unrestricted bank account owned by Abramovich. He can't benefit from the proceeds of any sale.
Let's talk a little bit then about the Ukrainian refugee crisis, and it clearly is a crisis. Estimates originally were around about 2 million people may well be leaving the country. Those look to be doubled. The British public is going to be asked to take in refugees themselves. Just explain a little bit more about that scheme.
Well, it's worth just talking about the full spectrum of our response to the humanitarian crisis. And first of all, we've donated aid valued at over £400 million to help the humanitarian crisis on the Ukrainian border. That's more than any other country in the world. And that is the response that the Ukrainian president principally asked for. And we've met that. We've done it more than any other country. Secondly, there is a route for people with family members, extended family members in the UK, to come over here. And the Home Secretary announced just yesterday that where people have family here and have a Ukrainian passport, then we're not going to require them to go and have biometric checks done, which was a bit of a bottleneck.
Sure, but just specifically on the opening of doors.
So thirdly, in addition to that, we're going to be making announcements in the very near future about a scheme for UK local authorities and indeed UK families to welcome Ukrainian refugees. We've announced that principle, and the details of how that scheme works will be laid out in the very near future.
Would you take anyone into your home? I mean, do we know of anyone in the cabinet that has already suggested that they might be willing to open their doors?
Well, I think once the details are published in the very near future, everybody will have a look at that and see if their personal circumstances allow them to. And, I'm sure the British public will look at that. And if they're able to, some people will be able to and some won't, they'll make their own decisions. Just
before we let you go, just closer to your brief, in fact, we've been hearing overnight, indeed yesterday, Facebook has made a temporary exception, as they're describing it, to those that have been affected by war, in essence allowing them on their platform to call for violence against Russia, something which Facebook would not allow in any other circumstances. Are you entirely sanguine with that?
Well, I haven't seen the details of that announcement, so I'm slightly reluctant to comment on what that proposal without having seen the details. What I do know is that the Russian government have been trying to block various social media platforms from operating in Russia as part of their disinformation campaign to try and essentially trick the Russian people. They're lying to the Russian people about what is happening, because if the Russian people realise the full extent of the atrocities being committed by Putin in their name, they would be extremely angry, and that is why Putin is trying to hide that from his own population.
I understand this is developing, but we have had a statement from Facebook's parent organisation, Meta. They say these are temporary measures designed to preserve voice and expression for people who are facing invasion. As always, we are prohibiting calls for violence against Russians outside of the narrow context of the current invasion. It's a narrow context, but again, I'm just wondering how you feel about one of the big tech giants, in essence, allowing people to call for violence against Russians in a way which we would probably not be allowed to do in the streets of the UK.
Well, I think it sounds like they're talking about specifically in Ukraine, and obviously the Ukrainian army and Ukrainian citizens have every right to defend their homeland, to defend their cities and their towns, to defend their hospitals against this aggression by Russia. And to be honest, if somebody was attacking Croydon, the place I represent, if somebody was bombing Croydon University Hospital, I tell you what, I would be in the streets defending my hospital. I'd be in the streets defending my town and my neighbours, as the Ukrainians are quite rightly doing.